Among the Wolves, Chapter 1. The Massacre. In the village of Schwenta lay deep in the Polish countryside, nestled against the ancient forests that stretched far beyond the reach of any road or map. For as long as Piotr could remember, it had been his home. The fields, the creeks, and the towering pines were as much a part of his family as his father, his mother, and his younger sister Anya. But tonight, under a sky clouded with smoke and fire, that familiar world became something twisted and unrecognizable. The screams began just after dusk, sharp and piercing, breaking the peaceful quiet that had settled over the village. Piotr was returning from the fields when he saw it. The first flickers of orange in the distance, licking hungrily at the wooden roofs. The Nazi forces had arrived. His heart hammered in his chest as he ran, barely able to breathe, the acrid scent of burning wood thickening in the air. Shadows flitted through the smoke like spectres, screams blending with shouts in a chaotic symphony. He moved through the haze, stumbling past broken bodies, shattered glass, and the twisted remnants of homes he knew so well. "Anya! Mama!" he shouted, his voice swallowed by the roaring flames, but only silence answered him. Piotr stumbled through the wreckage, his mind racing, unable to comprehend the nightmare unfolding around him. Figures in dark uniforms moved methodically, dragging villagers into the square, forcing them to their knees, rifles pointed at their heads. One by one, he watched his neighbors fall, each shot echoing like a death knell through the night. And then he saw her, his sister Anya, standing on the edge of the square, her small face pale with terror. She was barely 16, a wisp of a girl who should have been safe in the warmth of their home. But here she was, pulled from the shadows, her wide eyes fixed on Piotr as she spotted him through the smoke. "Piotr!" she screamed, and for a fleeting moment, hope flared in his heart. He was her big brother. He would save her, protect her, as he always had. But then he felt it, a rough, cold hand grabbing his shoulder, spinning him around. Before he could react, the butt of a rifle smashed into his face, sending him sprawling to the ground, his vision exploding with stars. Blood trickled down his face, warm and sticky, as he looked up to see a soldier towering over him, a cruel smile twisting his lips. The soldier's eyes held nothing human, only a hollow emptiness that mirrored the darkness consuming the village. Piotr tried to rise, but his body betrayed him, every muscle weak and trembling. "Look at him squirm!" the soldier sneered, kicking Piotr in the ribs, laughing as he crumpled to the ground. "A rat! Just like the rest of them!" Piotr's vision swam as he lay on the cold earth, the taste of blood sharp on his tongue. He could still see Anya, standing there, her gaze locked on his, her eyes pleading. But she was surrounded now, soldiers closing in on all sides. Her scream cut through the night as they dragged her away, a sound that would haunt Piotr for the rest of his days. "No!" he gasped, reaching out a trembling hand. But she was gone, swallowed by the shadows and flames. The village was reduced to ashes, each house a smouldering ruin, each life snuffed out without mercy. As Piotr lay in the mud, his heart twisted with grief and rage, he made a vow. He didn't care how or when, but he would make them pay. Every single one of them. They would know the same terror, the same despair that they had inflicted upon his family, his people. Hours passed as he drifted in and out of consciousness, the cold seeping into his bones as the sounds of violence gradually faded. When dawn broke, casting a pale, sickly light over the charred remnants of Schwenta, Piotr stirred, his body a mass of bruises and cuts. Somehow, he had survived, but survival was a hollow victory. The villagers' bodies lay scattered, their faces frozen in expressions of horror, their lives cut short in a single, brutal night. Piotr moved among them like a ghost, numb and empty, his heart a barren wasteland. His family was gone, his mother, his father, his sister. Nothing remained of them but ashes. Yet, as he wandered the ruins, something strange caught his eye. A figure, cloaked and still, standing at the edge of the forest. The man was tall, his face hidden beneath a hood, his form barely visible in the morning mist. There was something unnaturally still about him, as though he were not entirely human, but a shadow given shape. Piotr's breath hitched, a flicker of fear sparking in his chest. He was alone. Everyone he knew was gone. And now, this strange figure stood in silent witness, watching him with an intensity that felt like it could burn through his very soul. Who? Who are you? Piotr's voice was barely a whisper, hoarse from smoke and grief. The figure tilted his head, and though his face was obscured, Piotr could feel his gaze, piercing and ancient, like a weight pressing down on his chest. The figure raised a hand, slowly, deliberately, and in his palm lay something small and glinting in the early light. A silver whistle, polished to a gleaming shine. A gift, Piotr Kowalczyk, the figure said, his voice low and hollow, echoing as if from the depths of the earth itself. For those who seek vengeance. Piotr hesitated, his hand trembling as he reached out to take the whistle. The metal was cold against his skin, sending a jolt through his body, as though he were holding something alive, something with a heartbeat of its own. What does it do? He asked, his voice wavering. The figure's smile was a sliver of darkness, a glimpse of something beyond human comprehension. It summons the wolves, Piotr, but beware, for they are no ordinary beasts. They hunger, and they will claim their due. Use it wisely, or it may be your own soul they consume. And with that, the figure melted into the shadows, his form dissolving like mist in the morning sun, leaving Piotr alone in the ruins of his home, the silver whistle clutched tightly in his hand. He looked down at the whistle, its cold surface reflecting the broken world around him. Wolves. The old stories had spoken of spirits that dwelled in the depths of the forest, creatures bound to vengeance, called forth by those with a pure heart and a dark purpose. Legends whispered that they were not of this world, that their eyes glowed with an unnatural light, that their teeth could tear not only flesh, but the very soul. Piotr felt a shiver run through him, his grief and rage twisting into something darker, something hungry. He was alone, a single survivor of a massacre, and there was nothing left to hold him back. The whistle seemed to pulse in his hand, as if sensing his resolve, as if urging him forward. That night, as he sat alone in the ruins, he lifted the whistle to his lips. The sound that emerged was soft, barely a whisper, but it carried through the forest like a chill wind, spreading through the trees, reaching deep into the shadows. And from those shadows came the wolves. Their eyes glowed in the darkness, flickers of gold and red, like embers in the night. They moved in silence, their forms sleek and ethereal, more shadow than flesh, each step soundless as they circled him. Piotr felt no fear, only a strange, fierce exhilaration as he gazed into their eyes, seeing his own fury reflected back at him. These were not mere animals, they were spirits, bound by a power older than the earth itself, creatures that fed on the hatred and pain of those who summoned them. And Piotr was filled with both. "Help me," he whispered, his voice a tremor in the night. "Help me make them suffer." The wolves did not answer, but he could feel their assent, a dark pact forged in the silent night. They would have their due, and so would he. As the first howls rose into the air, echoing through the broken village, Piotr knew that his life was no longer his own. He was bound to the wolves now, his soul entwined with theirs, each driven by a hunger that could never be sated. The wolves vanished as silently as they had come, leaving only the chill of their presence in the air and the lingering echo of their howls. Piotr lay back on the cold ground, the silver whistle pressed to his lips, a strange, grim smile playing on his face. Vengeance was coming, and with it, the wolves. Chapter 2. The Prisoner and the Major. Piotr awoke to the harsh crack of a rifle butt against his ribs. Pain exploded through him, jolting him out of a fitful, half-conscious state. As his eyes struggled to focus, he became aware of his surroundings. His wrists and ankles were shackled with thick iron chains, and his body lay sprawled in the back of a truck as it rumbled through endless stretches of bleak countryside. He felt weak, his mouth dry and cracked, tasting of ash and dirt. Above, the sky was a dreary grey, the last remnants of smoke from his burning village lingering in the distance like a dark ghost haunting the horizon. A soldier loomed over him, his expression twisted with a cruel satisfaction as he prodded Pyotr again. "Get up, vermin!" he spat, his words dripping with contempt. "You're about to meet the man who'll decide whether you live or die." Pyotr staggered to his feet, struggling to steady himself against the rocking of the truck. His mind raced, fragments of memories flashing through his thoughts. The massacre, his sister's terrified scream, the shadowy figure, and the silver whistle still hidden in his pocket. He clutched the memory of the whistle like a lifeline, though he didn't dare touch it, afraid of what might happen if it was discovered. The truck slowed to a halt, and Pyotr was yanked from the vehicle, the soldiers' rough hands forcing him into line with a group of other captured villagers. Their faces were haggard, hollow, the light of hope extinguished from their eyes. They had seen what he had seen, felt the terror of that night etched forever into their souls. He barely had time to gather his thoughts before he was shoved forward, herded like livestock toward a towering stone structure surrounded by barbed wire and armed guards. It was a fortress of despair, the very air thick with the stench of fear and desperation. The soldiers pushed them through the gates, where an icy silence greeted them, as if even the land itself were complicit in the horrors that lay within. "Welcome to your new home," one of the guards sneered, gesturing to the bleak expanse of the camp. "Consider yourselves lucky. Few who enter these gates ever leave." Pyotr's stomach twisted as he was led deeper into the compound. Rows of barracks stretched out in all directions, each one a cage for the souls trapped within. The walls were lined with faded, peeling posters of propaganda, promises of order and purity, but the reality was a twisted nightmare, a place where humanity was discarded, leaving only broken shells of people. He was shoved into a barracks with the other prisoners, their faces drawn and pale, their eyes holding a silent plea for salvation that would never come. They lay on thin, dirty cots, their bodies covered in bruises, their spirits shattered. Pyotr felt the weight of their despair pressing down on him, suffocating him like a dark cloud. The guards left them in silence, locking the door behind them with a metallic clang that echoed through the barracks. Pyotr sank onto an empty cot, clutching his bruised ribs, his mind reeling. He could feel the cold weight of the whistle hidden in his pocket, a small, defiant reminder that he still had some control, some semblance of power. But for now, he was trapped, just like the others. As the days dragged on, Pyotr was assigned to labor under the watchful eyes of the guards. He worked alongside the other prisoners, hauling heavy stones, cleaning the barracks, and performing menial tasks until his muscles ached and his hands bled. There was no respite, no mercy. Every action, every breath he took was monitored, judged, punished if he faltered. But the worst part was the Major. Major Horst Vetter was a towering figure of malice, his presence casting a dark shadow over the camp. He moved through the barracks like a spectre, his boots echoing against the concrete as he inspected his prisoners with a gaze colder than death itself. He took pleasure in their suffering, his sadistic nature manifesting in the twisted games he played, the punishments he inflicted with a casual cruelty that left no doubt as to his hatred for them. Pyotr learned quickly to keep his head down, to avoid the Major's attention. But fate had other plans. One evening, as Pyotr scrubbed the barracks floor, he became aware of a heavy silence falling over the room. He looked up to see Major Vetter standing in the doorway, his eyes fixed on Pyotr with a predatory gleam. The room seemed to grow colder, the air thick with dread as the Major approached him. "Ah, Kowalczyk, isn't it?" Vetter's voice was smooth, deceptively calm, like the calm before a storm. He towered over Pyotr, his lips curling into a smile that held no warmth. "I've heard interesting things about you." Pyotr kept his gaze lowered, his hands trembling as he clenched the brush in his grip. Every instinct screamed at him to stay silent, to endure whatever was coming. But the Major wasn't one to be ignored. "Look at me when I'm speaking to you," Vetter commanded, his voice laced with steel. Reluctantly, Pyotr lifted his head, meeting the Major's gaze. Vetter's eyes were as dark as coal, bottomless pits that seemed to drink in the fear around him. There was no humanity in them, only an unyielding hatred, a twisted desire to see others suffer. "I hear you're quite the rebel, Kowalczyk," Vetter continued, his smile widening. "Your people seem to have a talent for resistance." Do you consider yourself brave, or are you simply a fool? Pyotr gritted his teeth, forcing himself to remain silent. Veter's words were laced with malice, each one a calculated barb meant to provoke him, to strip away his dignity piece by piece. "Answer me," Vetter said, his voice dropping to a whisper that sent a chill down Pyotr's spine. "Do you think you're brave?" Pyotr's mouth was dry, his voice barely more than a rasp as he forced himself to respond. "No, sir." Vetter chuckled, a low, menacing sound that echoed through the empty barracks. "Good, that's wise, Kowalczyk, because bravery gets you nowhere in a place like this. Remember that." With a final, contemptuous glance, Vetter turned and strode out of the barracks, leaving Pyotr trembling in his wake. The other prisoners avoided his gaze, their own fear palpable as they resumed their work in silence. But Pyotr felt something else simmering beneath the surface, a dark, consuming rage that threatened to swallow him whole. He clutched the whistle hidden in his pocket, feeling its cold weight pressing against his palm. The memory of the wolves, their haunting eyes and razor-sharp teeth, lingered in his mind like a promise. He could summon them, unleash them upon this place, upon Vetter and his twisted regime, but he knew there was a cost. The shadowy figure had warned him, and he could feel the truth of it in his bones. The wolves would come at a price that might demand more of him than he was willing to give. Still, as the days passed and the Major's cruelty only grew, Pyotr's resolve hardened. He watched as his fellow prisoners suffered, as they were beaten, starved, and broken. Each act of violence chipped away at his humanity, until all that remained was a hollow shell filled with hatred and a single, unrelenting purpose. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the shadows deepened, Pyotr slipped out of his cot, clutching the whistle in his hand. The barracks were silent, the other prisoners lost in restless sleep or too exhausted to care. He crept to the edge of the camp, his heart pounding as he brought the whistle to his lips. The sound that emerged was soft, almost inaudible, but it seemed to resonate through the air, a low, mournful note that carried far into the night. Pyotr waited, his breath shallow, his eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. And then he saw them. The wolves emerged from the shadows, their forms barely visible in the dim light, their eyes glowing like embers in the night. They moved silently, their paws gliding over the earth without a sound, their gazes fixed on Pyotr with a hunger that sent a shiver down his spine. He didn't speak, didn't dare to. The wolves seemed to understand, their silent obedience a testament to the pact they had formed. They were bound to him now, bound by the darkness within him, by the hatred that had consumed him since the night his village burned. With a single gesture, he directed them toward the guard post, watching as they slipped through the camp like phantoms, their forms blending with the shadows. The guards didn't even have time to scream. The wolves tore through them with a ferocity that was both beautiful and horrifying, their teeth sinking into flesh, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. Pyotr watched, his heart pounding with a mixture of terror and exhilaration. He had unleashed a force beyond his control, a darkness that mirrored the depths of his own soul, and as the blood stained the ground, he knew there was no turning back. The wolves returned to him, their muzzles slick with blood, their eyes filled with an intelligence that was both familiar and alien. They had tasted vengeance, and they wanted more. Pyotr could feel their hunger, a hunger that echoed his own, that called to the darkest parts of him. In the silence that followed, he whispered a single word, a command that bound them to his will. "Vetter." The wolves' ears pricked, their eyes narrowing with a predatory gleam. They understood. Pyotr had made his choice. And in the darkness, with the taste of blood lingering in the air, he knew that he had crossed a line that would lead him deeper into the abyss, into a world where only shadows and blood remained. As he returned to the barracks, the whistle cold in his hand, he felt a strange sense of calm settle over him. He had become something more than human, something bound to the darkness, to the wolves that lurked within him, and he knew, with a certainty that filled him with both dread and satisfaction, that he would stop at nothing to see Major Vetter pay. In the distance, a lone wolf howled, its mournful cry echoing through the camp, a sound that promised vengeance and blood. Chapter 3. The Mysterious Stranger. A thick fog hung over the camp, seeping into every corner and crevice like a silent predator. The air was damp and heavy, pressing against Pyotr's skin with a cold, invasive chill that seemed to sink into his bones. Darkness clung to every edge, every shadow. It was the kind of night where secrets festered, and fears that usually slumbered in the back of one's mind came crawling to the forefront. The silence in the barracks was stifling. Pyotr lay in his cot, eyes wide open, heart racing with an energy that he couldn't quite suppress. He'd tried to ignore it, the prickling sense of unease that had been haunting him since he'd summoned the wolves, the memory of their glowing eyes, their inhuman snouts stained with blood, lingered with him, making the shadows seem thicker, closer. Outside, somewhere beyond the barbed wire and guard posts, a low, guttural howl drifted through the fog, sending a shiver down Pyotr's spine. He wasn't sure if he had truly heard it, or if it was simply his mind, twisting his fear into something tangible, but deep down, he knew. Just as he knew he'd given something away to that shadowy figure in the forest. The wolves were not creatures of this world. They were something far older, something darker. He clutched the silver whistle beneath his shirt, its chill pressing against his chest. It was a reminder of the pact he'd made and the power he'd unleashed. But it was also a weight, a burden, something that seemed to grow colder each time he touched it, as if it drew its chill from another realm. He hadn't dared to summon the wolves again, not since that night, but the whistle was always there, a constant reminder that he had crossed a boundary he could never uncross. His mind drifted back to the shadowy figure he'd met at the edge of the forest, the one who had gifted him the whistle. The stranger's face was a blur, hidden beneath a hood that seemed woven from the very fabric of night, his voice a haunting whisper that resonated deep within Pyotr's mind. That voice had promised vengeance, had told him that the wolves would come at his call, but it had offered no comfort, no assurance of safety, only a warning Pyotr had chosen to ignore. Now, as the fog crept into the barracks like a living thing, he felt the weight of that warning more than ever. A sudden creak shattered the silence, and Pyotr sat up, heart pounding, eyes darting toward the door. The barracks were still, the other prisoners huddled in their cots, eyes closed, but he knew better than to assume they were asleep. Fear had a way of keeping people alert, even when they pretended otherwise. Another creak echoed through the room, followed by the sound of footsteps, soft and measured, growing louder with each passing second. The door swung open slowly, and a figure stepped inside. Pyotr's breath caught in his throat as he recognized the familiar outline, the figure from the forest, the one who had gifted him the whistle. The stranger stood in the doorway, cloaked in shadows, his face hidden beneath the hood, his presence filling the room with an unnatural cold that seemed to seep into the very walls. "Pyotr!" The stranger's voice was a whisper, barely audible, but it carried through the room with an eerie clarity, as though it were speaking directly to his soul. Pyotr swallowed, his throat dry, his hands clenching the rough fabric of his cot. He glanced at the other prisoners, but they remained still, seemingly oblivious to the figure standing in their midst. It was as though the stranger existed in a realm separate from theirs, a shadow that moved unseen by mortal eyes. Without a word, the stranger turned and stepped back outside, vanishing into the fog. Pyotr hesitated, fear gnawing at his gut, but he knew he had no choice. The whistle was cold against his chest, pulsing with a strange energy, as if urging him forward. He slipped from his cot, his movements silent, and followed the stranger out into the night. The fog was thick, curling around him like the tendrils of some ghostly serpent, obscuring everything beyond a few paces. The camp was eerily quiet, the guards nowhere to be seen, as if the entire world had fallen into a deep slumber. Pyotr's footsteps were muffled, swallowed by the dense mist, and each step he took felt heavier, as though he were moving through water. The stranger led him through the camp, past the barracks and guard posts, until they reached the edge of the forest. Here, the fog seemed to thin, revealing the dark silhouettes of towering trees, their branches stretching toward the sky like skeletal fingers. The stranger stopped at the tree line, his form barely visible, a shadow among shadows. "You've called upon the wolves," the stranger's voice drifted through the air, low and haunting. "And now they are bound to you. But know this, Pyotr, vengeance is a double-edged blade." Pyotr shivered, the weight of the stranger's words settling into his chest like a stone. He'd known there would be a price, but he had never imagined it would feel so personal. The wolves had answered his call, had brought him justice, but he could feel their presence lingering in the corners of his mind, a dark and relentless hunger that mirrored his own. "What are they?" Pyotr whispered, his voice barely more than a breath. "They're not just animals. They're something else." The stranger tilted his head, a faint smile curving beneath the hood, a smile that held no warmth. "They are creatures of the forgotten realms, spirits bound to vengeance and darkness. They feed on the hatred in your heart, drawn to it like moths to flame. But beware, Pyotr, for they are not loyal to you. They are loyal only to the shadows." Pyotr's heart sank as the stranger's words echoed in his mind, each syllable a chilling reminder of the pact he had made. He could feel the darkness within him, the hatred that had driven him to summon the wolves, but now it felt like a poison, seeping into his very soul. "Why did you give me the whistle?" Pyotr asked, his voice trembling. "Why me?" The stranger's gaze was unyielding, a piercing stare that seemed to strip away the layers of his soul, leaving him bare and exposed. "Because you carry a darkness within you, a hunger for vengeance that the wolves recognize. They are bound to you because you are one of them, Pyotr, a soul consumed by shadows." A shiver ran through Pyotr, his hands trembling as he clenched his fists. He had thought himself a man seeking justice, a man driven by the desire to avenge his family, his village. But now, standing at the edge of the forest, he realized that he was something else entirely. He was a vessel for the wolves, a beacon that called them forth from the darkness. "But remember this, Pyotr," the stranger's voice was soft, almost gentle. "The wolves are not bound to your will. They are free spirits, creatures of darkness and hunger. If you lose control, if you allow your hatred to consume you, they will turn on you. And when they do, they will devour you whole." Pyotr's blood ran cold as the stranger's words sank in, a dark realization settling into his mind. He had thought he could control the wolves, that he could wield their power to exact his vengeance. But now he understood. The wolves were not tools to be used. They were forces of nature, bound to no master, loyal only to the darkness from which they came. A silence fell between them, the air thick with tension. The stranger's gaze remained fixed on him, his expression unreadable, as though he were weighing Pyotr's very soul. And then, without another word, he turned and vanished into the forest, his form dissolving into the shadows like a wisp of smoke. Pyotr stood alone, the fog swirling around him, the weight of the stranger's warning pressing down on him like a heavy shroud. The whistle was cold against his chest, a constant reminder of the pact he had made, of the wolves that lurked in the shadows, waiting for his command. He turned and walked back toward the camp, his footsteps heavy, each step echoing with the weight of his newfound knowledge. The camp lay silent, the barracks looming in the darkness like tombstones, and he could feel the eyes of the wolves on him, watching from the shadows, their hunger a constant, gnawing presence in his mind. As he slipped back into the barracks, he could feel the darkness settling into his bones, a cold, relentless force that seemed to pulse in time with his heartbeat. The other prisoners lay in their cots, oblivious to the terror that lurked just beyond the barbed wire, the wolves that waited, bound to his will, yet beyond his control. He lay down, closing his eyes, but sleep eluded him. The stranger's words echoed in his mind, a haunting reminder of the price he had paid, of the darkness that had taken root within him. And as he lay there, listening to the faint howls that drifted through the fog, he knew that he had crossed a line, that he had become something less than human. For in his heart, he carried the wolves, and they were hungry. Chapter 4: The Howling in the Night. And the camp lay under the heavy cloak of midnight, a world painted in black and shadows. Pyotr lay awake in his cot, his mind racing with fragmented thoughts and whispered fears that gnawed at the edges of his sanity. Each passing night seemed darker, each breath he took filled with the acrid smell of despair and something far worse, something rotten, like decaying wood in a deep forest untouched by light. He could still feel the silver whistle pressed against his chest, a constant, chilling reminder of the wolves he had summoned and the deaths they had brought. Since that night, strange sounds had begun echoing through the camp. They were subtle at first, a quiet rustling, the faint whisper of leaves brushing against one another, but soon they grew louder, evolving into a low growl that seemed to rise from the very ground beneath him. The other prisoners had noticed too. They lay huddled in their cots, faces pale with fear as the sounds filled the silence, their eyes wide with the kind of terror that seeped into one's bones. It was a terror Pyotr knew well. The wolves had come at his call, yes, but he had sensed something in them that unsettled him. They were creatures of vengeance, bound to his anger and grief. Yet there was something more, something ancient and dark, a power that felt limitless and dangerous. The wolves were not bound by mortal laws. They roamed the shadows with their own twisted form of justice, driven by a hunger that knew no end. He sat up, his body tense, eyes scanning the dimly lit barracks. The air was thick, suffocating, each breath feeling like a struggle. The other prisoners lay deathly still, pretending to sleep. But Pyotr could see the fear in the way their bodies trembled under their thin blankets. And he could hear it too, the howling that had started just beyond the camp's barbed wire, faint and haunting, growing louder with each passing night. The first howl had been soft, almost mournful, a distant echo that drifted through the camp like a forgotten memory. But as the nights went on, the howling intensified, filling the air with a bone-chilling resonance that seemed to come from every direction at once. The guards were on edge, their eyes darting nervously as they patrolled the camp, rifles clenched tightly in their hands. The wolves were close. Pyotr could feel it in his bones, as though they were watching him from the shadows, waiting for his next command. The camp had become a place of fear, a kingdom of shadows where even the bravest souls dared not wander alone after dark. But amid the chaos, Pyotr found a strange, dark satisfaction. Major Feta was visibly shaken. His once unyielding confidence had begun to crack, replaced by a growing paranoia that ate away at his authority. Each time the wolves howled, he would flinch, his eyes darting toward the forest as if he expected to see them emerge from the trees. It was on one such night, as the wolves' howls pierced the darkness, that Pyotr felt a shift, a cold dread creeping over him, as though the very fabric of reality had begun to unravel. He lay still, listening, his heart pounding as the howls grew louder, merging into a single, unearthly wail that filled the air with a terrifying resonance. The sound was unnatural, vibrating through his bones, filling him with an inexplicable sense of dread. Suddenly, the door to the barracks swung open with a loud creak, and a figure stepped inside. It was Major Feta. His face was pale, his eyes hollow, dark shadows pooling beneath them as though he hadn't slept in days. His hand gripped his pistol, his knuckles white, and his gaze was wild, darting from one prisoner to another as if he expected them to leap from their cots and attack. "You!" Feta's voice was sharp, laced with fear and anger as he pointed directly at Pyotr. "Come with me!" Pyotr's heart skipped a beat, but he forced himself to stand, his body tense as he met Feta's gaze. The other prisoners watched in silence, their faces etched with a mixture of sympathy and fear, as though they knew he was being led to his doom. Feta motioned for Pyotr to follow, and together they stepped out into the frigid night air. The camp was silent, save for the distant, haunting howl of the wolves that drifted through the trees like a ghostly lullaby. Feta's footsteps were quick and uneven, betraying the anxiety simmering just beneath the surface. They walked toward a secluded corner of the camp, where a small, dimly lit shack stood, its windows dark and cracked. Pyotr had seen this shack before, but had never dared to approach it. It was a place of punishment, a place where those who defied the Major met their end. But tonight, it seemed even more sinister, the shadows clinging to it like a shroud, hiding something unspeakable within. "Inside!" Feta barked, his voice trembling as he shoved Pyotr forward. Pyotr stepped into the shack, the door slamming shut behind him. The darkness was thick, suffocating, the faint smell of blood lingering in the air. He could hear Feta's breathing, harsh and uneven, as he lit a lantern, casting a sickly yellow glow over the room. The shack was empty, save for a single wooden chair bolted to the floor and a heavy iron chain that lay coiled beside it like a sleeping serpent. Pyotr's gaze flickered to the chain, a chill creeping over him as he realized its purpose. "Sit," Feta commanded, his voice cold, a thin veneer of control masking the fear lurking beneath. Piotr complied, his body rigid as he sat in the chair, the wood creaking beneath his weight. Vetter moved swiftly, wrapping the chain around his wrists and ankles, binding him in place with a cruel precision. Each link was cold and unyielding, biting into his flesh as though it had a will of its own. For a long moment, Vetter simply stared at him, his eyes dark and unreadable, his face twisted into a mask of anger and fear. Piotr met his gaze, his heart pounding, but he forced himself to remain calm, to keep his expression neutral. "You think you're clever, don't you?" Vetter sneered, his voice laced with venom. "You think I don't know what you've done?" Piotr remained silent, his eyes narrowing as he watched Vetter, trying to read the man's intentions. But Vetter was unpredictable, his mind a maze of cruelty and paranoia, and Piotr knew better than to provoke him. "You and your tricks," Vetter spat, his voice trembling. "I know about the wolves. I know you've summoned them. But mark my words, Kowalczyk, you will not defeat me." Piotr's heart raced as Vetter's words sank in. How could he know? No one had seen him use the whistle. No one knew of the pact he had made. Yet Vetter's gaze was filled with a certainty that sent a chill down his spine, as though he had peered into Piotr's soul and seen the darkness lurking there. "You are nothing, Kowalczyk," Vetter hissed, his face inches from Piotr's. "A rat, scurrying in the shadows. But I am the hunter, and I will crush you, just as I have crushed all who defy me." Piotr forced himself to remain still, his hands clenched in his lap as Vetter's words washed over him. He could feel the silver whistle pressing against his chest, its presence a cold comfort, a reminder that he was not as powerless as Vetter believed. As Vetter stepped back, a faint smile twisted Piotr's lips, a spark of defiance flaring within him. The wolves were his now, bound to his will, and he would not cower before this man. He had seen the power that lay within them, the darkness that lurked in their eyes, and he knew that they would answer his call, no matter the cost. Vetter's gaze hardened, his lips curling into a snarl as he noticed Piotr's defiant expression. "You think this is a game, don't you?" he growled, his voice low and dangerous. "You think your little tricks can scare me?" Without warning, Vetter struck him, the force of the blow sending a sharp pain through Piotr's jaw. He tasted blood, warm and metallic as it filled his mouth, but he did not look away. He met Vetter's gaze with a cold, unyielding stare, his defiance a silent promise of the vengeance that awaited. Vetter's hand trembled as he pulled back, his eyes flickering with uncertainty. For a brief moment, Piotr saw a glimpse of fear in the man's gaze, a crack in his iron facade, and he knew that the wolves' howls had reached him too, seeping into his mind, filling his dreams with shadows and blood. "You will break, Kowalczyk," Vetter whispered, his voice barely audible, his eyes dark and haunted. "Just like all the others." With a final, lingering glance, he turned and left the shack, leaving Piotr alone in the darkness, the door slamming shut behind him. The silence was thick, oppressive, broken only by the faint echo of the wolves' howls that drifted through the night, a chilling reminder of the pact he had made. Bound to the chair, Piotr closed his eyes, his mind drifting to the wolves, to their glowing eyes and blood-stained muzzles, to the hunger that lurked within them, a hunger that echoed his own. They were creatures of vengeance, bound to his will, driven by the same darkness that had consumed him since the night his village burned, and he knew, with a certainty that filled him with both dread and satisfaction, that they would come for him, just as they had come for the guards. Chapter 5. The First Summoning. And the camp lay blanketed in a thick silence, the kind that settled like dust, untouched and undisturbed. Even the wind dared not blow, as if fearful of stirring the shadows that lurked within the fog. It was an oppressive stillness, one that weighed on Piotr's chest as he lay in his cot, clutching the cold silver whistle that rested against his heart. The memory of the shadowy stranger's warning lingered in his mind like an echo, a haunting reminder that each step he took down this path came at a price. The wolves were bound to him, yes, but they were creatures of their own will, spirits driven by hunger and vengeance, and yet they were there in his thoughts constantly, a dark presence that gnawed at his consciousness, reminding him of their presence with every beat of his heart. They were loyal only to his hatred, drawn to the darkness within him, and he could feel them, like shadows on the edges of his mind, waiting, watching. He shifted in his cot, feeling the chill in his bones. It was deeper than the cold of the camp. It was a chill that came from within, a gnawing dread that made him wonder if he had truly understood the depths of the power he had called upon. But even as the fear crept in, he felt the familiar anger flare in his chest, stoked by the memory of his family, his village, the lives stolen and the blood spilled. And with that anger came the hunger for vengeance, a need so raw and overpowering that it silenced his doubts. The silence in the barracks was absolute. The other prisoners lay still, eyes closed, their bodies tense even in sleep. Fear was a constant companion here, one that shared every cot, every corner, every breath. But tonight, Pyotr felt a different kind of fear settle over him. A fear that whispered to him from the shadows, urging him to act, to release the power he held in his hands. A sound, faint yet distinct, drifted into the barracks, a low, distant howl that seemed to cut through the fog like a blade. Pyotr's heart skipped a beat, his fingers tightening around the whistle. The wolves were out there, waiting, and he knew with a certainty that they were calling to him, urging him to summon them. He rose from his cot, moving with silent steps as he made his way to the door. The other prisoners stirred, sensing his movement, their eyes following him with a mixture of fear and curiosity. They did not know of the power he held, but they could feel the weight of it, the darkness that clung to him like a second skin. Outside, the camp was shrouded in fog, the air thick and still, as if the very world held its breath. Pyotr moved through the mist, the whistle pressed against his chest, feeling its cold weight, its pull. He reached the edge of the camp, his heart pounding as he stepped beyond the barbed wire, into the shadows of the forest. Here, the fog seemed to thicken, curling around him like tendrils, obscuring everything beyond a few paces. He lifted the whistle to his lips, his hand trembling as he blew a single soft note. The sound was barely audible, a whisper that seemed to vanish into the fog, but he felt it resonate through him, a dark vibration that stirred something deep within his soul. For a moment, there was only silence. And then, from the depths of the forest, he saw them, the wolves. They emerged from the shadows, their forms shifting and insubstantial, as if they were woven from the very darkness itself. Their eyes glowed with an unnatural light, flickers of crimson and gold that pierced through the fog, locking onto him with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. They moved with an eerie grace, silent and predatory, their bodies blending seamlessly with the shadows around them. Pyotr's breath hitched as he took in the sight, a mixture of fear and awe coursing through him. These were not ordinary wolves. They were spirits, creatures of vengeance and hunger, bound to him yet free in a way that he could barely comprehend. He could feel their power, a dark, pulsing energy that seemed to vibrate through the air, filling him with a sense of dread and exhilaration. They were his now, his to command. But he knew that their loyalty was a fragile thing, bound only by the darkness within him, by the hatred that had called them forth. Veta, he whispered, the name slipping from his lips like a curse. The wolves tilted their heads, their eyes narrowing as they listened, their ears pricked in anticipation. He could feel their hunger, a gnawing, relentless need that mirrored his own, and he knew that they understood. They would hunt, they would kill, but they would demand something in return, a part of him, a piece of his soul that would forever be theirs. With a silent gesture, he directed them back toward the camp, watching as they slipped into the shadows, their forms disappearing into the fog. The silence that followed was heavy, oppressive, and he felt a strange emptiness settle over him, a hollow ache that filled the space they had left behind. As he made his way back to the barracks, his mind raced with thoughts of vengeance, of the justice he would bring down upon Veta and his guards. But beneath the exhilaration, he felt a lingering fear, a dark whisper that reminded him of the price he would pay, of the wolves' unyielding hunger that would never be satisfied. He slipped back into his cot, the whistle cold against his chest, and closed his eyes, the sound of distant howls echoing in his mind as he drifted into a restless sleep. When morning came, the camp was in chaos. The bodies of 2 guards were found just outside the barracks, their faces twisted in terror, their flesh torn and bloody. Whispers spread quickly among the prisoners, each one more fearful than the last, as they spoke of the wolves, of creatures that lurked in the shadows, waiting to claim anyone who dared to cross their path. But Pyotr knew the truth. He had called them, had bound them to his will, and they had answered. The taste of vengeance was bittersweet, a satisfaction tainted by the fear that had taken root within him, a fear that reminded him of the power he held and the darkness that came with it. Major Vetter was furious, his face pale with anger and fear as he barked orders at the guards, his voice sharp and grating as he demanded answers. But no one could explain the attack. No one could understand the darkness that had descended upon the camp like a shroud. Pyotr watched from a distance, his expression unreadable, his heart pounding with a mixture of satisfaction and dread. The wolves were his now, bound to him by a bond he could barely comprehend, and he knew that they would return, drawn to his hatred, his need for vengeance. But with each passing day, he felt the weight of their presence growing, a dark, gnawing hunger that seemed to echo his own. The wolves were not bound to him. They were bound to the shadows, to the darkness that lived within him, and he could feel that darkness spreading, consuming him, piece by piece. As the days turned into weeks, the wolves' attacks continued, each one more brutal than the last. The guards grew restless, their eyes filled with fear as they spoke of shadows that moved on their own, of howls that echoed through the night like the cries of lost souls. Vetter grew more paranoid, his once unyielding authority crumbling as he struggled to maintain control. He paced the camp, his eyes darting toward the forest with a mixture of fear and hatred, as if he knew that something lurked within the shadows, waiting for the moment to strike. And Pyotr watched it all, a silent spectator, his heart filled with a dark satisfaction as he saw the man who had taken everything from him brought to his knees by a fear he could not understand. But even as he reveled in Vetter's downfall, he felt the weight of his own fear growing, a fear that whispered to him from the shadows, reminding him of the price he had paid and the darkness that had taken root within him. For he knew that the wolves were not his to control. They were creatures of the shadows, bound only by the darkness that lived within him, and he could feel that darkness spreading, consuming him, bit by bit, piece by piece. The wolves had come at his call, had brought him vengeance, but he knew that they would demand something in return. A part of him, a piece of his soul that would forever be theirs. And as he lay in his cot, listening to the distant howls that echoed through the camp like a haunting lullaby, he knew that he had crossed a line he could never uncross, had become something less than human, something bound to the darkness, to the wolves that lurked within him. For in his heart, he carried the wolves, and they were hungry. Chapter 6. A Pact with the Wolves. But the camp had fallen into a terrified silence. The soldiers' bravado was gone, replaced by fear that lurked in every corner, every shadow. The guards moved in pairs now, their eyes wide and nervous, clutching their rifles with white-knuckled grips. Each night brought new whispers, new rumors, and the echo of distant howls that chilled even the bravest among them. Pyotr could feel the power he held over them, an unspoken authority born from the terror he had unleashed. The wolves were bound to him now, creatures of the night that moved unseen through the shadows, spirits of vengeance that answered only to his call. But even as he reveled in the fear he had sown, he could feel the darkness within him growing, a shadow that crept deeper into his soul with each passing day. The wolves' hunger was unrelenting. They were not content with mere bloodshed. They demanded something more, something deeper. He could feel their presence constantly, like a second heartbeat, a dark rhythm that pulsed in time with his own. The silver whistle hung heavy around his neck, a cold reminder of the pact he had made, a bond forged in blood and shadows. The other prisoners kept their distance, their eyes averted, their bodies tense with fear and suspicion. They knew something had changed in him, that he was no longer the same man he had once been. He could see it in their faces, in the way they flinched when he passed, the way their whispers fell silent when he entered the room. They sensed the darkness within him, sensed the wolves that lurked in the shadows of his soul, and they feared him. One night, as he lay in his cot, he felt a familiar chill settle over him, a cold that seeped into his bones, filling him with an indescribable sense of dread. The air was thick and oppressive, the silence heavy, as though the very world held its breath. And then, in the darkness, he heard it. A soft, whispering voice that seemed to drift through the air, calling to him. "Pyotr!" He sat up, his heart pounding, his gaze darting around the barracks. The other prisoners lay still, their bodies motionless, as though they were frozen in time. The voice called to him again, a haunting whisper that sent a shiver down his spine. "Come." Without thinking, he rose from his cot, moving as though in a trance, his steps silent as he made his way to the door. The whistle was cold against his chest, a steady weight that seemed to pull him forward, guiding him toward the source of the voice. He stepped out into the night, the fog curling around him like ghostly fingers, obscuring everything beyond a few feet. The voice called to him again, soft and insistent, drawing him deeper into the shadows. He moved through the camp, past the barracks and guard posts, his steps silent and sure. The guards were nowhere to be seen, as though they had vanished into the mist, leaving him alone in the silent, empty world. He reached the edge of the camp, where the forest loomed like a wall of darkness, its branches stretching toward the sky like skeletal fingers. The fog was thick here, obscuring everything beyond a few steps, and he felt a shiver of unease as he stared into the shadows. "Come." The voice was clearer now, a low, haunting whisper that seemed to seep into his mind, filling him with an inexplicable sense of dread. He stepped into the forest, the fog swirling around him, the darkness closing in like a shroud. As he moved deeper into the woods, he felt the presence of the wolves, their eyes glowing like embers in the darkness, their forms shifting and insubstantial, blending seamlessly with the shadows. They moved silently, their bodies gliding through the mist, their gaze fixed on him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. He stopped in a small clearing, the fog swirling around him, the wolves circling him like dark phantoms. He could feel their hunger, a gnawing, relentless need that seemed to echo his own, and he knew that they were waiting, watching, bound to him by the pact he had made. And then, from the shadows, the figure emerged. It was the stranger from the forest, the one who had given him the whistle, his form barely visible beneath the hood that seemed woven from the very fabric of night. His gaze was cold and piercing, his presence filling the clearing with an unnatural chill that made Pyotr's breath catch in his throat. "Pyotr." The stranger's voice was a whisper, a haunting sound that seemed to resonate within him, filling him with a deep, inexplicable fear. "You have called upon the wolves, and they have answered, but they are not yours to command." Pyotr swallowed, his throat dry, his hands clenching at his sides. I thought they were bound to me." The stranger tilted his head, a faint smile curling beneath the hood. "They are bound to the darkness within you, to the hatred that fuels your soul. But they are creatures of the shadows, loyal only to their own hunger. And that hunger is unending." Pyotr felt a chill run through him, his heart pounding as the stranger's words sank in. He had thought himself in control, had believed that he could wield the wolves like a weapon, a tool to exact his vengeance. But now he realized that he was little more than a vessel, a conduit through which the wolves fed, drawn to the darkness within him like moths to a flame. What do they want from me?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. The stranger's gaze was unyielding, his eyes dark and unreadable. "They want what they have always wanted, Pyotr. They want blood, they want souls. And they will not be satisfied until they have taken everything from you." A shiver of fear crept over him as he looked at the wolves, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light, their bodies shifting and insubstantial, as though they were barely tethered to the mortal realm. He could feel their hunger, a deep, insatiable need that seemed to mirror his own, a hunger that would never be sated, no matter how much blood was spilled. He took a step back, his gaze darting between the wolves and the stranger, his mind racing with fear and confusion. "I didn't ask for this," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I only wanted justice. Vengeance." The stranger's smile was cold, a sliver of darkness that held no warmth. "And you have it, Pyotr. But vengeance is a poison, one that consumes everything it touches. The wolves are bound to you now, drawn to the hatred in your heart. They are your vengeance, your darkness, and they will feed until there is nothing left. Piotr felt a wave of despair wash over him, a hollow emptiness that seemed to echo the darkness within him. He had wanted justice for his family, for his village, had wanted to make those who had wronged him suffer. But now he realized that he had become something else entirely, something bound to the shadows, to the hunger that had taken root within him. The stranger stepped closer, his gaze piercing, his presence filling Piotr with a deep, inexplicable fear. You have a choice, Piotr. You can release the wolves, allow them to consume everything in their path, or you can let go of the hatred, the darkness, and set yourself free. Piotr's heart pounded, his mind racing as he weighed the stranger's words. He could feel the wolves' eyes on him, their hunger a constant, gnawing presence, a reminder of the power he held, the darkness that had taken root within him. But he knew, deep down, that the choice was an illusion. The wolves were a part of him now, bound to his soul, drawn to his hatred, his need for vengeance. He could no more let them go than he could let go of his own heartbeat, his own breath. The stranger watched him in silence, his expression unreadable, and Piotr felt a shiver of dread as he realized that he had already made his choice, that the path he had chosen was one from which there was no return. With a final, lingering glance, the stranger turned and vanished into the shadows, his form dissolving into the mist like a wisp of smoke. Piotr stood alone in the clearing, the wolves circling him, their eyes fixed on him with a predatory intensity that sent a chill down his spine. He lifted the whistle to his lips, his hand trembling as he blew a single, soft note. The sound was barely audible, a whisper that seemed to vanish into the fog, but he felt it resonate through him, a dark vibration that stirred something deep within his soul. The wolves froze, their bodies tense, their eyes locked onto him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. He could feel their power, a dark pulsing energy that seemed to vibrate through the air, filling him with a sense of dread and exhilaration. "Go," he whispered, his voice barely more than a breath. "Find them. Feed." The wolves moved as one, their forms slipping into the shadows, their eyes glowing with a fierce, predatory hunger. Piotr watched them go, a hollow emptiness settling over him, a reminder of the price he had paid, the darkness he had embraced. As he made his way back to the camp, he could feel the weight of the wolves' hunger pressing down on him, a constant gnawing presence that echoed his own. The whistle was cold against his chest, a steady weight that seemed to pull him deeper into the shadows, into the darkness that had become his world. And he knew, with a certainty that filled him with both dread and satisfaction, that he was bound to the wolves now, bound to the darkness, to the hunger that would never be sated. For he was theirs, and they were his, and together they would feed. Chapter 7. The Shadow Realm. Night had fully settled over the camp, a suffocating darkness that was almost tangible, pressing in on all sides. The usual murmur of voices and footsteps was absent. The prisoners and guards alike seemed to cower beneath the weight of the unseen horrors that Piotr had unleashed. His pact with the wolves was not a secret anymore. Not truly. Though no one dared to speak of it directly, fear lingered in every glance cast his way, and he could sense the ripple of unease that followed him wherever he went. The wolves had continued their reign of terror each night, their attacks growing more brutal, more violent. It was as if they were no longer simply following his commands, but were feeding off the fear and darkness within the camp itself. Piotr's control over them felt tenuous, slipping further from his grasp with each passing day. And deep within him, he sensed a change, an insidious darkness spreading through his veins, as though he were becoming one with the creatures he had summoned. He lay in his cot, staring up at the wooden beams above him, the silver whistle cold against his chest. Sleep was a distant memory. Each night was a vigil, waiting for the wolves to return, for their eerie howls to cut through the silence like a blade. He felt them out there, circling, watching, bound to him, but only by a sliver of control that he knew could snap at any moment. The room was deathly quiet, the other prisoners lying motionless in their cots, their breaths shallow and strained. No one spoke, no one moved. It was as if the very air had grown heavy with fear, thick and impenetrable, leaving them all trapped in a web of silent dread. And then, from beyond the walls of the barracks, he heard it. A voice, low and insidious, whispering his name. Pyotr. The sound was soft, barely more than a murmur, but it sent a chill racing down his spine. He sat up, eyes wide, scanning the darkness for the source of the voice. But there was nothing, only the shadows, thick and impenetrable, stretching across the room like tendrils of night. Pyotr. Come. The voice called to him again, a haunting whisper that seemed to seep into his mind, filling him with a strange sense of longing and dread. He rose from his cot, moving as though in a trance, his steps silent as he crossed the room. The other prisoners remained motionless, their eyes closed, oblivious to the dark presence that had descended upon them. He stepped outside, the cold night air biting into his skin, and immediately felt the weight of the fog pressing in around him. It was denser than usual, swirling in thick tendrils that obscured everything beyond a few feet. The camp was eerily silent, as if the world itself were holding its breath. The voice whispered his name again, drawing him deeper into the fog, toward the edge of the forest. He moved through the mist, his steps slow and deliberate, each one filling him with a mounting sense of dread. He knew that he was being led, guided by something beyond his understanding. But he couldn't stop himself. Something deep within him compelled him forward, urging him to answer the call. As he approached the forest, he saw them, the wolves, their eyes glowing in the darkness, their forms shifting and insubstantial, as though they were woven from the very shadows themselves. They circled him, silent and watchful, their gaze fixed on him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. But they did not attack. They simply waited, their bodies tense and poised, as though anticipating something. And then, from the depths of the forest, he saw it. A figure, cloaked in shadows, emerging from the darkness. It was the stranger from the forest, the one who had given him the whistle, his face hidden beneath a hood that seemed to absorb the very light around it. His presence filled the clearing with an unnatural chill, a darkness that seemed to pulse and breathe, seeping into the earth and air like a poison. A Pyotr! The stranger's voice was a whisper, soft and haunting, yet it seemed to echo through the trees, resonating in the very fabric of the night. Pyotr felt a shiver of fear as he met the stranger's gaze, his heart pounding as he realized that this was no ordinary man. There was an otherworldly quality to him, an aura of darkness and power that felt both ancient and terrifying. Who are you? Pyotr's voice trembled, barely more than a breath, but he forced himself to stand tall, to meet the stranger's gaze without flinching. The stranger tilted his head, a faint smile curving beneath the hood. I am a guide, a keeper of shadows, he murmured, his voice low and melodic, like the rustling of leaves in a midnight breeze. I am the one who opened the door for you, Pyotr, the one who gave you the power you now wield. Pyotr swallowed, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of the stranger's words. He felt a mixture of awe and fear, a sense that he was standing before something far beyond his comprehension. Why did you give me this power? Pyotr demanded, his voice steadier than he felt. Why did you give me the wolves? The stranger's smile widened, his eyes gleaming with a dark amusement. Because you asked for it, Pyotr. You called out to the shadows, and the shadows answered. You sought vengeance, and the wolves were drawn to your hatred, to the darkness within you. Pyotr's heart pounded as the stranger's words sank in, a chill creeping over him as he realized the truth. He had unleashed the wolves, had bound them to him with his own hatred, his own darkness. They were not merely tools of vengeance. They were a reflection of his own soul, a manifestation of the shadows that had taken root within him. Is there a price? Pyotr whispered, his voice barely audible. What have I given in return? The stranger's gaze was unyielding, his expression unreadable. You have given them your soul, Pyotr, he said softly. With each life they take, with each act of vengeance, the darkness within you grows, consuming you piece by piece. The wolves are bound to you, yes, but you are also bound to them, and in time, they will devour you, body and soul, until there is nothing left. Pyotr felt a wave of despair wash over him, a hollow emptiness that seemed to echo the darkness within him. He had wanted justice, vengeance for his family, his village, but now he realized that he had become something else entirely. He was a vessel for the wolves, a conduit for their hunger, and with each act of violence, he was losing himself, slipping further into the shadows. "Is there no escape?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Can I not free myself?" The stranger's smile was cold, a sliver of darkness that held no warmth. "There is a way," he said, his voice soft and haunting. "But it comes at a price. You must journey to the shadow realm, Pyotr. You must confront the darkness within yourself, the very essence of the wolves. Only then can you hope to break the bond that ties you to them." Pyotr's heart raced as the stranger's words sank in. The shadow realm, a place of myth, a realm where spirits dwelled, a world beyond the mortal plane. He had heard of it in stories, whispered tales of those who had ventured into the darkness, never to return. How do I enter the shadow realm?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. The stranger extended a hand, his fingers long and slender, his skin as pale as bone. "Take my hand, Pyotr," he murmured, "and I will guide you." Pyotr hesitated, fear gnawing at his gut, but he knew that he had no choice. He had already crossed a line, had already bound himself to the wolves, and there was no turning back. With a deep breath, he reached out and grasped the stranger's hand, his fingers cold and unyielding. The world shifted around him, the ground falling away as he was pulled into a whirlpool of shadows, a darkness that seemed to stretch on forever. He felt himself falling, tumbling through an endless void, his senses overwhelmed by the sheer weight of the darkness. And then, suddenly, he was standing in a vast, desolate landscape, a world shrouded in perpetual twilight. The sky was a sickly grey, the air thick with a strange metallic scent. Shadows moved in the distance, shifting and writhing like living things, and he could hear the faint echo of whispers, voices that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. "This is the shadow realm, Pyotr." The stranger's voice was a soft murmur, barely audible over the whispering wind. "A place where the boundaries between life and death, between light and darkness, are blurred. Here, you will confront the wolves, the darkness within yourself, and only then can you hope to be free." Pyotr felt a chill run through him as he took in the desolate landscape, the shadows that seemed to pulse and breathe, filling the air with a sense of dread. He could feel the wolves here, their presence stronger than ever, their hunger a constant gnawing presence that filled him with a sense of impending doom. Where are they?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. The stranger gestured toward the distance, where a faint flickering light glowed on the horizon. "They wait for you, Pyotr," he said softly. "They are bound to you, drawn to the darkness within your soul. Go to them, confront them, and perhaps you will find the freedom you seek." Pyotr took a deep breath, his heart pounding as he stepped forward, his gaze fixed on the distant light. The ground beneath him was cold and unyielding, the shadows swirling around his feet, filling the air with a sense of dread. Each step was a struggle, as though he were moving through water, his limbs heavy and unresponsive. The wolves' presence grew stronger with each step, their hunger a constant gnawing presence that filled him with a sense of impending doom. He could feel them in the shadows, watching, waiting, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. Finally, he reached the clearing, the flickering light illuminating the wolves' forms, their bodies shifting and insubstantial, as though they were woven from the very darkness itself. They circled him, their eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made his skin crawl, their hunger palpable, a force that seemed to pulse in time with his own heartbeat. He took a deep breath, his gaze steady as he met their eyes, his voice a low, steady whisper. "I am here to face you," he said, his voice barely more than a breath, "to confront the darkness within myself." The wolves watched him in silence, their eyes gleaming with a dark amusement, and he knew that he was truly bound to them, that their hunger was his own, a reflection of the darkness that had taken root within him. And in that moment, he understood. The wolves were not merely spirits of vengeance. They were a part of him, bound to his soul, a manifestation of his own hatred, his own need for retribution. Chapter 8. The curse unveiled. The air in the shadow realm grew colder, pressing in on Pyotr like a dark weight that seemed to seep into his very bones. He could feel the wolves' eyes on him, their gaze as sharp and unyielding as the biting wind that swept through the desolate landscape. The shadows around him felt alive, shifting and pulsing with a malevolent energy, as though the land itself was watching, waiting for him to act. The wolves circled him in silence, their forms flickering in and out of visibility like phantoms, woven from the fabric of night. They were patient, unhurried, their movements graceful yet predatory. Pyotr sensed their hunger, a bottomless, relentless need that mirrored the darkness festering within him. It was a hunger that could never be sated, a curse that bound them to this world, just as it bound him to them. He took a deep breath, his chest tight as he gathered the courage to speak. "Why am I here?" he demanded, his voice low but steady. "What is this curse that binds us together?" The wolves paused, their eyes glinting with an eerie, unnatural light. They watched him in silence, their gaze piercing, as though they could see the very soul that lay hidden beneath his flesh. And then, to his shock, one of them stepped forward, its eyes narrowing as it regarded him with a curious intensity. "We are bound to you." The wolf's voice was a guttural, whispering growl, a sound that seemed to come from deep within the earth itself. "Bound by the hatred that consumes your heart. You called to us, Pyotr, summoned us from the shadows with your need for vengeance." Pyotr shivered, his hands clenching at his sides as he felt the weight of the wolf's words. He had known, on some level, that the darkness within him had drawn them, had bound them to his will. But hearing it spoken aloud, hearing the confirmation of his own guilt, was like a knife twisting in his gut. "Is there no way to break the bond?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Is there no way to be free?" The wolf's gaze remained fixed on him, its eyes cold and unfeeling. "The bond cannot be broken," it replied. "Not by any means known to mortal man. We are as much a part of you as the breath in your lungs, the blood in your veins. You may try to flee, but you will find no sanctuary, no escape. The curse is eternal, bound by the blood you spilled, the souls you sacrificed." A wave of despair washed over Pyotr, a hollow, gnawing emptiness that seemed to echo within him like a dark, mocking laugh. He had thought himself a man seeking justice, a man avenging the wrongs done to him and his family. But now he realized that he was something far worse, a soul consumed by darkness, bound to the shadows, cursed for eternity. The wolves continued to circle him, their eyes glinting with an unsettling mixture of hunger and amusement, as though they could taste his despair, savoring it like a fine wine. He felt their presence pressing in on him, a suffocating weight that threatened to crush him, to drown him in the darkness that had taken root within his soul. But even as the despair threatened to consume him, a spark of defiance flared in his chest, a stubborn refusal to surrender to the shadows. He had been wronged, had lost everything to the cruelty of those who had taken his family, his village, his life. He would not allow the wolves to dictate his fate, to condemn him to a life of endless suffering. "What if I refuse?" he said, his voice low but firm. "What if I choose to fight you, to resist this curse?" The wolves regarded him with a dark amusement, their eyes narrowing as though he had just told a particularly amusing joke. The one who had spoken stepped forward again, baring its teeth in a twisted semblance of a smile. "Resistance is futile, Pyotr," it growled. "You are bound to us, as we are bound to you. The curse is unbreakable, forged in blood and shadows, sealed by the hatred that fuels your heart. You may try to fight it, but you will only find yourself sinking deeper into the darkness." Pyotr clenched his fists, his heart pounding as he stared into the wolf's eyes, defiance burning in his gaze. He would not give up. He would not allow himself to be consumed by the darkness, no matter the cost. He had survived too much, had fought too hard, to be defeated by his own demons. He took a step forward, his voice steady and unwavering as he spoke. "Then I will find a way. I will find a way to break this curse, to free myself from you and your darkness. You may be bound to me, but I am not your puppet. I will not be controlled by your hunger, your hatred." The wolves' eyes gleamed with a dark, predatory gleam, their bodies tense and coiled, as though they were waiting for him to make a move, to give them an excuse to strike. But he held his ground, his gaze unyielding, his determination unbreakable. And then, to his surprise, the wolves began to laugh, a low, guttural sound that echoed through the clearing like the rumble of distant thunder. It was a cruel, mocking sound, filled with a twisted amusement that sent a shiver down his spine. "You are a fool, Pyotr," the wolf sneered. "A blind, stubborn fool, clinging to hope like a drowning man grasping at straws. The darkness is already within you, consuming you from the inside out. You may resist, but in the end, you will find yourself broken, your soul devoured, your mind lost to the shadows." Pyotr felt a surge of anger at the wolf's words, a fierce, burning rage that seemed to ignite within him like a fire. He would not be defeated. He would not allow himself to be consumed by the darkness. He was stronger than that, stronger than the curse that bound him. He took a step closer to the wolf, his gaze cold and unyielding, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "I am not afraid of you," he said, his words laced with venom. "I have faced death, faced the horrors of this world, and I have survived. I will survive this too. I will find a way to break this curse, to free myself from your darkness." The wolf's smile faded, its eyes narrowing as it regarded him with a cold, calculating gaze. For a moment there was silence, a tense, electric stillness that hung in the air like a storm on the verge of breaking. And then, slowly, the wolf inclined its head, a faint, grudging respect flickering in its gaze. "Very well, Pyotr," it said, its voice low and dangerous. "If you are so determined to defy us, then we will give you a chance. But know this: you will not find freedom in the light. The only path to salvation lies in the heart of the darkness, in the shadows that bind us together." Pyotr's heart raced as the wolf's words sank in, a mixture of fear and anticipation flooding through him. He had been given a chance, a path forward, but it was a path fraught with danger, a journey that would take him deeper into the darkness than he had ever ventured before. But he was ready. He had come this far, had sacrificed everything for the sake of his vengeance, and he would not stop now. He would face the darkness, confront the shadows that lurked within his soul, and find a way to break the curse that bound him. With a deep breath, he nodded, his gaze steady as he met the wolf's eyes. "Then show me the way," he said, his voice firm and unwavering. "Show me the path, and I will walk it. I will confront the darkness, and I will find a way to free myself from you." The wolf's eyes gleamed with a dark, unsettling light, a mixture of amusement and something else, something that almost resembled pride. It inclined its head, a faint, mocking smile curving its lips. "Very well, Pyotr," it said, its voice low and smooth. "Follow me, and I will show you the path to salvation. But be warned, the journey will be perilous, the trials unlike anything you have ever faced, and should you falter, should you show weakness, the darkness will consume you, body and soul." Pyotr nodded, his jaw set, his heart pounding as he steeled himself for the journey ahead. He knew the risks, understood the danger, but he was ready. He had come too far, sacrificed too much to turn back now. The wolf turned, its body gliding through the shadows with a grace that was both beautiful and terrifying. Pyotr followed, his steps silent, his gaze fixed on the path before him. A path that seemed to twist and writhe like a living thing, leading him deeper into the heart of the shadow realm. They walked in silence, the only sound the faint rustle of leaves and the soft, rhythmic padding of the wolf's paws against the ground. The air grew colder, the shadows darker, as they ventured deeper into the forest, a place where the boundaries between worlds seemed to blur, where reality itself seemed to waver and shift. Finally, they reached a clearing, a vast open space bathed in an eerie, otherworldly light. In the center of the clearing stood a massive ancient tree, its branches twisted and gnarled, its bark as black as coal. The tree pulsed with a dark, malevolent energy, a force that seemed to radiate from its core, filling the air with a sense of dread. "This is the heart of darkness," the wolf said, its voice barely more than a whisper. "The source of the curse that binds us, the place where the shadows are born. If you wish to be free, you must confront the darkness within this tree, face the very essence of the wolves, the source of your curse." Pyotr swallowed, his heart pounding as he stared at the tree, a sense of awe and fear filling him as he took in its twisted form. He could feel the darkness within it, a force as ancient as time itself, a power that resonated with the shadows that had taken root within his soul. He took a step forward, his gaze fixed on the tree, his mind racing with a mixture of fear and determination. This was it, the final test, the moment that would decide his fate. Chapter 9. The Confrontation with Darkness. The heart of darkness loomed before Pyotr, a monstrous ancient tree that pulsed with a malevolent energy. Its twisted branches reached toward the sky like skeletal fingers, and the bark was black as pitch, seething with shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. The air was thick with a chill that gnawed at his bones, an oppressive presence that weighed down on him, threatening to crush him beneath its dark weight. Pyotr took a deep breath, his hands trembling as he steeled himself for what lay ahead. The wolf, his spectral guide, stood beside him, its eyes glinting with a dark amusement that was unsettling, a reminder that this was a trial he would face alone. The creature's fur blended seamlessly with the shadows, its form shifting and insubstantial, as if it were a mere fragment of the darkness that surrounded them. "This is it, Pyotr," the wolf murmured, its voice a low growl that seemed to echo within his mind. "The darkness that lies within this tree is the source of the curse that binds us. Confront it, and you may break the chains that hold you. Fail, and you will become one with the shadows, lost to the void for all eternity." Pyotr nodded, swallowing the fear that threatened to choke him. He had come too far, endured too much to turn back now. His soul bore the scars of the vengeance he had unleashed, and the wolves that had become a part of him would not allow him to rest until he had faced the darkness that had taken root within him. This was his only chance to be free, to rid himself of the shadows that haunted his every step. He stepped forward, his boots sinking into the dark, damp earth as he approached the heart of darkness. The tree loomed before him, its bark shifting like smoke, revealing glimpses of something ancient and unspeakable. He could feel its power, a cold, unyielding force that resonated with the very essence of the shadow realm. It was as if the tree itself was alive, aware, watching him with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. As he drew closer, he felt a strange pull, an invisible force that seemed to draw him toward the tree, urging him to reach out, to touch the darkness that pulsed within it. His fingers tingled with anticipation, and he felt a hollow ache in his chest, a yearning that he couldn't explain. It was as though the darkness called to him, whispering his name in a voice that was both familiar and terrifying. He lifted his hand, hesitating for a moment as he felt the weight of the shadows pressing down on him, filling his mind with memories of the pain, the loss, the hatred that had driven him to this place. The faces of his family flashed before his eyes, the image of his village burning, the sounds of their screams echoing in his mind like a haunting refrain. But beneath the pain, beneath the anger, he felt something else, a deep, unyielding determination, a spark of defiance that had kept him alive, that had driven him to seek vengeance against those who had wronged him. He clenched his fist, his gaze hardening as he reached out and placed his hand against the rough, pulsing bark of the tree. The world shifted. A dark, crushing force surged through him, filling him with a cold so intense that it felt like his very soul was being torn apart. The shadows wrapped around him, seeping into his skin, his veins, his bones, consuming him from the inside out. He felt himself slipping, falling into an endless void of darkness, his mind unraveling as the boundaries between himself and the shadows began to blur. He was no longer Pyotr Kowalczyk. He was something else, something bound to the darkness, a creature of the shadows, a vessel for the hatred and rage that had driven him to this place. Voices echoed in his mind, harsh and mocking, a cacophony of whispers that seemed to come from every direction, filling his mind with words that he couldn't understand, yet somehow knew were meant for him. Vengeance, hatred, pain. The words twisted around him like tendrils of smoke, coiling through his thoughts, filling him with a sense of despair so deep that it felt as though he were drowning. He struggled, fought to free himself from the darkness that clung to him, that seeped into his very being, but it was too strong, too overwhelming. He felt his memories slipping away, fading into the shadows, the faces of his family, the image of his village, all of it dissolving into the void. He was losing himself, becoming one with the darkness, a creature bound to the shadows, a being of vengeance and hatred, stripped of everything that had once made him human. "No!" he screamed, his voice a raw, desperate cry that echoed through the void, piercing the shadows with a force born of sheer will. He clenched his fists, his body trembling as he fought against the darkness that sought to consume him. He would not let it win. He would not allow himself to be swallowed by the shadows. He was Pyotr Kowalczyk, a man who had fought, who had suffered, who had endured more than any soul should be forced to bear. He was more than the darkness, more than the hatred that had driven him. With a surge of strength, he pushed back against the shadows, forcing them out, reclaiming his mind, his memories, his identity. The darkness resisted, clinging to him like a parasite. But he fought it with everything he had, tearing it away, bit by bit, until he felt a glimmer of light, a spark of hope that flickered within him like a dying flame. The shadows recoiled, retreating as he stood his ground, his gaze fierce, his determination unbreakable. He was Pyotr Kowalczyk, a man who had been wronged, but he would not allow that wrong to define him. He was more than his hatred, more than his need for vengeance. He was a man, a soul, a being of light and shadow, bound to the darkness yet unbroken. He felt the presence of the wolves around him, their gaze watching him with a mixture of awe and fear, as though they too had sensed the shift within him, the strength that had allowed him to stand against the darkness. They circled him, their forms flickering and insubstantial, their eyes gleaming with a light that was both fierce and reverent. "You have resisted the darkness, Pyotr," one of the wolves spoke, its voice a low, rumbling growl that resonated within his mind. "You have proven yourself stronger than the curse that binds you, but the darkness is still within you, a part of you that will never truly be gone." Pyotr nodded, his heart heavy with the weight of the truth. He could feel the darkness within him, a presence that would always be there, lurking in the shadows of his soul, a reminder of the hatred and pain that had driven him to this place. But he had chosen to resist it, to fight it, to hold on to the light within him, no matter how small, no matter how fragile. "Then I will live with it," he said, his voice steady and unyielding. "I will carry the darkness with me, but I will not let it control me. I am more than my hatred, more than my need for vengeance. I am Pyotr Kowalczyk, and I choose my own path." The wolves regarded him in silence, their eyes filled with a respect that was almost palpable, a recognition of the strength and courage that had allowed him to face the darkness and emerge unbroken. They bowed their heads, their forms flickering as they began to fade, their voices a soft, mournful whisper that seemed to echo through the shadows. "We are bound to you, Pyotr," they murmured, "bound by the curse that ties us to the darkness, but also by the strength that allows us to resist it. You have proven yourself worthy, and we will follow you in darkness and in light." As the last of the wolves faded into the shadows, Pyotr felt a strange sense of peace settle over him, a quiet acceptance of the darkness within him, and the light that he had fought to preserve. He had faced the heart of darkness, confronted the curse that bound him, and had emerged with his soul intact. The shadow realm began to fade around him, the darkness giving way to a soft, dim light, as though he were awakening from a long, endless dream. He felt his body growing lighter, the weight of the shadows lifting, leaving him with a sense of clarity and purpose that he had not felt in years. When he opened his eyes, he found himself back in the camp, standing at the edge of the forest, the fog thick and silent around him. The air was cold, the night still, but he felt a warmth within him, a light that flickered in his chest, small but unbreakable. The silver whistle hung heavy around his neck, its surface gleaming in the moonlight, a reminder of the power he held and the curse that he had chosen to carry. But it no longer felt like a burden. It was a part of him now, a symbol of the darkness he had faced and the strength that had allowed him to overcome it. He took a deep breath, his gaze steady as he looked out over the camp, a new resolve filling him. He was bound to the wolves, bound to the shadows, but he was no longer their prisoner. He had chosen his path, had reclaimed his soul, and he would carry the darkness within him as a reminder of the man he had become. And as he walked back into the camp, he knew that he was no longer the man he had once been. He was Pyotr Kowalczyk, a man who had faced the darkness and emerged whole. And though the shadows would always be with him, he was free. Chapter 10. The Final Reckoning. And the fog hung heavy over the camp, swallowing the faint light of dawn as though it were reluctant to release its hold on the night. Pyotr moved silently through the mist, his footsteps nearly soundless on the damp ground. The camp was still, blanketed in an unnatural silence that seemed to vibrate with a sense of expectation, as if the very air held its breath, waiting for the storm to break. The silver whistle hung around his neck, cold and steady against his chest. It was a reminder of the journey he had taken, the shadows he had faced, and the curse he had chosen to carry. The wolves were with him, bound to him by a force that transcended the physical realm. They waited in the fog, their eyes gleaming with an otherworldly light, their bodies tense and ready. They too sensed that the end was near, that everything had come to this moment. The door to Major Vetter's quarters loomed before him, an imposing structure in the heart of the camp, fortified and heavily guarded. But now there was no movement, no sign of life. The guards had retreated, their fear of the wolves surpassing even their loyalty to the Major. Pyotr could feel their presence in the distance, huddling in the shadows, their eyes wide with terror, praying that they would be spared from the horrors that awaited. He placed a hand on the door, feeling the cold metal beneath his fingers, and took a deep breath. The hatred he had once felt for Vetter was still there, simmering beneath the surface, but it no longer controlled him. He had become something else, something stronger, more resilient, bound to the darkness, but no longer consumed by it. This was not vengeance, not anymore. This was justice. With a final, steadying breath, he pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was dark, the only light coming from a flickering oil lamp on the far wall. Major Vetter sat at his desk, his face illuminated by the weak, wavering light. His eyes were hollow, his skin pale and drawn, as though he hadn't slept in days. He looked up as Pyotr entered, his gaze filled with a mixture of fear and rage, his hands clenching into fists. "So," Vetter sneered, his voice low and venomous, "the ghost of Schwenter returns." Pyotr met his gaze without flinching, his expression calm and unreadable. He could feel the presence of the wolves behind him, their eyes glinting in the shadows, their silent anticipation filling the room with an oppressive weight. "You've taken everything from me, Vetter," Pyotr said, his voice steady and unwavering. "My family, my village, my life. I came here to make you pay for what you've done, to make you understand the pain you've caused. But now I see that you're nothing more than a coward, hiding behind your power, your cruelty. You don't deserve my hatred." Vetter's face twisted with rage, his eyes narrowing as he rose to his feet, his hand reaching for the pistol at his side. "I don't need your pity, Kowalczyk," he spat, his voice shaking with fury. "You are nothing, a rat, a pest to be exterminated. I have crushed men stronger than you, destroyed lives without a second thought. And you think you can come here, to my camp, and threaten me?" Pyotr's gaze remained steady, unflinching. He could feel the darkness within him, the shadows that pulsed in time with his heartbeat. But he did not give in to them. He had faced his own demons, had conquered the curse that bound him, and he would not allow Vetter's hatred to drag him back into the shadows. "I'm not here to threaten you, Vetter," Pyotr said, his voice quiet but filled with an unbreakable resolve. "I'm here to end this." He lifted the whistle to his lips and blew a single piercing note. The sound was soft, almost a whisper, but it resonated through the room with a force that was both physical and spiritual, a call that reached beyond the veil, summoning the wolves from the shadows. They appeared, one by one, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light, their forms shifting and insubstantial, as though they were woven from the very fabric of darkness itself. They moved silently, circling Vetter, their gaze fixed on him, with a hunger that was both predatory and patient. Vetter's face paled, his hand trembling as he clutched the pistol, his gaze darting between the wolves and Pyotr. For the first time, the mask of arrogance and cruelty slipped, revealing the fear that lay beneath, a fear that was raw and primal, as though he could sense the end drawing near. What are they?" he whispered, his voice trembling. "What have you done?" "They are the darkness you created, Vetter," Pyotr replied, his voice calm and steady. The shadows you've cast over the lives you've destroyed. They are bound to me, but they are here for you. Vetter raised the pistol, his hands shaking as he aimed it at Pyotr, his gaze filled with a desperate fury. You think you can control me? You think you can control them? I am Major Horst Vetter. I am the law here. Pyotr held his gaze, unafraid, his expression calm. You are nothing, Vetter. You are a man who has lost his soul, consumed by his own hatred, his own need for power. The darkness you created has come for you, and there is no escape. With a cry of rage, Vetter fired, the bullet slicing through the air, but the wolves moved as one, their forms shifting, merging with the shadows as they closed in around him. The bullet passed through them as though they were smoke, harmless, ineffectual. Vetter staggered back, his face a mask of terror as the wolves circled him, their eyes gleaming with a predatory light. He fired again and again, each shot echoing through the room, but the bullets passed through the wolves without leaving a mark, as though they were ghosts, creatures of the night that could not be harmed by mortal weapons. Please, Vetter whispered, his voice breaking, his gaze wild with fear. Please, don't. I didn't mean. But his words trailed off, lost in the silence as the wolves closed in, their bodies shifting and insubstantial, their eyes fixed on him with a hunger that was both ancient and unrelenting. They moved as one, a dark, swirling mass of shadows, their bodies blending together, forming a single, unbroken circle around him. Pyotr watched, his gaze steady, his expression unreadable. He felt no pity, no remorse. This was justice, a reckoning for the lives that Vetter had destroyed, the families he had torn apart. The wolves were his to command, but they were also bound to a higher purpose, a force that transcended the mortal realm. They were agents of darkness, creatures of vengeance, and they would not rest until their hunger was sated. As the wolves closed in, Vetter's screams filled the room, a sound that was raw and desperate, filled with a terror that was almost tangible. The shadows wrapped around him, swallowing him whole, consuming him in a darkness that was both physical and spiritual, a force that stripped him of everything he had once been, reducing him to nothing more than a memory, a whisper lost to the night. And then, as suddenly as they had appeared, the wolves were gone, their forms dissolving into the shadows, leaving only silence in their wake. Pyotr stood alone in the empty room, his gaze fixed on the spot where Vetter had stood, his mind filled with a quiet, profound sense of peace. The darkness was still within him, a part of him that would never truly be gone, but he no longer felt its weight, no longer felt the pull of the shadows. He had faced his own demons, had conquered the curse that bound him, and had found a way to make peace with the darkness within him. The wolves were gone, their hunger sated, their purpose fulfilled, and he was free. As he turned to leave, he felt a faint, cool breeze brush against his skin, a whisper of the shadows that lingered in the air, a reminder of the journey he had taken, the battles he had fought. He walked out into the mist, the camp quiet and still around him, the fog lifting as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon. He looked up, his gaze fixed on the sky, a sense of hope filling him as he took a deep breath, feeling the warmth of the morning sun on his face. The darkness was still there, a part of him that would always be with him, but he had chosen his path, had chosen to carry the light within him, no matter how small, no matter how fragile. And as he walked away from the camp, away from the shadows that had haunted him, he knew that he was no longer the man he had once been. He was Pyotr Kowalczyk, a man who had faced the darkness and emerged whole, a man who had found peace in the heart of the shadows. The journey was over, but he would carry its lessons with him always. He was free, yet bound by the memories, the scars, the shadows that would always be a part of him. And though the darkness would remain within him, he had chosen to live in the light, to walk a path that was his own. For he was more than his vengeance, more than his hatred. He was a man, a soul, a survivor, bound to the darkness yet unbroken. And as he disappeared into the mist, the faint echo of a howl drifted through the air, a final farewell from the wolves that had shared his journey, a haunting reminder of the shadows he had conquered, and the strength that had allowed him to walk away, whole and unbroken, into the light.